So thank you, Mitra, for that extremely embarrassingly long introduction. It's great to be here, and thanks, Mitra, also for giving me the chance to come here. What I'm going to talk about today is a project that I've just finished. So this is actually the title of the book, and it's coming out from Chicago University Press next April, March, April. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about the overall project of the book, and then hone in on one chapter and give you a little more detail about that. My talk tomorrow that Mitra very kindly mentioned in the History of Science department is the next project, the project I'm about to start, and that's on a slightly later period and looks at slightly different issues. Doctoring tradition. Of course, one of my esteemed colleagues and good friend, Rob Kohler, once told me that you can't have a good book without a good pun in the title. So here's the pun. It both is about the reinvention of the Ayurvedic medical tradition, as well as it's about doctoring, of course. And this is a kind of these are the chapters I have. The notion that I'm trying to pitch in the book is what I call braided science, and I'm trying to think of different sciences as not being mutually, not engaged in the colonial. People talk of the colonial encounter, and encounter has a bad ring in India. It's usually used for dodgy police shootouts of people who are then called criminals in retrospect. So I don't like the term encounter much, and I would like to move away from this whole business of encounters. I would rather like to propose a model of cultural interaction between different systems of knowledge that are both equally heterogeneous on both sides, and individual strands are creatively pulled together and braided together. I like the metaphor of braiding. It also has some resonances with Indic philosophy and Samkhya, which I can go into later if anybody's interested. So that's what I'm trying to push for the book. I have I give the first chapter, the Vaidya Bourgeois World, gives basically a historical sociology of Ayurvedic practitioners at the end of the 19th century in Bengal. And then the core of the book is about 4 case studies where I look at small technologies like pocket watches, thermometers, microscopes, and injections. How these small little technologies, through their incorporation into Ayurvedic clinical practice, operationally changed the way Ayurvedists thought about the body. So I'm interested in changes in the way people thought about the body. Now it's on the scholarship on Asian medicine generally, not just in Ayurveda, but also in Chinese medicine and Siddha in Unani. It's well accepted today that traditional medicine is not some kind of ossified form of medicine that actually goes back 5,000 years, even though that's what all those who market traditional medicine always tell you. This is a 5,000-year-old thing. It's all been reinvented, recodified, standardized in relatively recent times. And that, I'm interested in that modern Ayurveda. What is it that actually changes? Now, usually people say Ayurvedic medicine has changed today because if you look at the government colleges that teach you Ayurvedic medicine, it incorporates a lot of anatomy teaching, like classes on physiology, classes on anatomy, etc. But if you go back to the history of this modernization process, it started way before anybody was being taught anatomy, number one. And number two, the historiography of anatomy in Western medicine, which is now pretty rich, tells us that anatomy is not this kind of monolithic thing. You just don't cut open a corpse and see these things. You have to be trained how to see things in the body. And different people seeing the same corpse would come to different conclusions. Their eyes have to be trained, and that's why you need to go to medical school to become a Western doctor as well. And so I'm pulling on those ideas and seeing that when the Ayurvedic modernization process started, which is in the 1860s, which is when you first start getting this kind of new, self-consciously modern Ayurveda, at that period, nobody was being taught anatomy. Nobody was dissecting a corpse. Nobody who, there were people dissecting corpses, but they were not practicing Ayurveda. Those who were practicing Ayurveda were not dissecting corpses. So how did their ideas about the body change? And my argument is it changed not because somebody forced them to learn dissection, but it changed because they started adopting these small technologies, things like thermometers, things like pocket watches. So pocket watch is my first case study. I'm not going to go into that today, but I'm going to go into the second one, which is the thermometer. Now, here is an illustration from a book published in the 1870s, a Bengali book, Ayurvedic book called Kobiraji Shikha, or Ayurvedic education. And you can see here there's an illustration of a thermometer, and they're talking about a thermometer. For anybody in the room who might read Bengali, you might also see another mismatch. It's called Tapman Jantra. Now, the word Tapman is usually used for weather or climate. It's not used for body temperature. So there already you have a clue about where it's coming from. It was originally introduced into India as a meteorological device. Thermometers weren't used to test body temperatures. They were used to test the temperature of the weather. So these were weather devices, and which is not atypical. in the adoption of thermometers into Western medicine also basically starts. There are people who are doing it in the early 18th century, but it only gets standardized by around the 1860s by a British doctor, Thomas Clifford Albert, and German Dr. Karl Wunderlich, who both of whom push the adoption of thermometers and body heat as a diagnostic form of data. So it only dates from the 1860s in Western medicine too. So these Bengali texts are not too far behind that. They're just about 10, 15 years later. Now, what's interesting about these texts is that they posit no real conflict between the data produced by the thermometer, the temperature that you can read from the thermometer, and earlier data that was produced by older diagnostic technologies, particularly by what is called Nadi Pariksha, or pulse diagnosis, even though I don't like it because, again, it equates it with Western pulse diagnosis, which it is not really, but some kind of feeling the pulse was the principal technology of diagnosis. So before these tools started coming in, most Ayurvedists would go to if they went to see a patient, one of the key diagnostic things they would do is they would sit there and feel your pulse. And that, what these texts say is that, well, this is just doing the same thing, but doing it simply. That would entail if the data produced by a thermometer and the data produced by pulse diagnosis were exactly the same, that of course has implicit in it the assumption that the Ayurvedic understandings of the body perfectly match the Western understandings of the body, which is absolutely not true. And what I will try to talk to you about today is how the coming in of the thermometer actually changes Ayurvedic ideas of the body. Though that change is denied in these texts because they're consciously trying to equate the two, they're trying to say they're same, but if you actually look back and closely read pre-colonial texts, you will see that there is a shift. And so I have here two extracts. I'm not going to read them out because I don't want to waste time reading them out. I'll just highlight what the points I want to make from them. One is that heat does not, so this is the key text, by the way, the Roga Vinishchaya of Madhava, which is an 8th century text. By the 18th century, in Bengal at least, that was the main standard text that everybody read. If you became a Kaviraj or a practicing Ayurvedist, that was your textbook. It was not the older classics of Charaka and Shushruta, which are usually mentioned, but this one. And if you look at the definitions of fever in that text, it usually does not either, as over here, it does not even mention heat as a symptom of fever. So there are other symptoms, but heat does not come up. Unless you consider this reference to visceral fire, to be some kind of a reference to heat, even though visceral fire or Pakagni is a very specific concept in Ayurveda. And Vijayarakshita, who writes the most popular commentary on Madhava, actually goes on to say as much, that visceral fire is used in order to exclude the fire of the elements in the body. So he's clearly saying there are different types of fires in the body, that all fires are not the same, and he's not using it in the sense of heat at all. Madhava also gives you another definition of heat, of fever, where there is a reference to heat, and it's called glowing heat here, a general sense of glowing heat. But again, if we read Vijayarakshita's commentary, we'll find that this phrase, it looks much simpler than it actually is. Because what is meant by glowing heat, does it mean the heat that the patient perceives? Or does it mean the heat that the physician feels? And of course, for anybody who's had fever, which I take it everybody in this room has had at some point or the other, there's a big difference between what the patient feels and what somebody touching the patient feels. The patient often feels cold when the external person touching the body feels the skin to be warm. So it's the subjective perception of heat and the objective perception of heat are not at all the same thing. Moreover, there's a third sense in which Vijayarakshita says it's used, which is the mind getting heated. And so you babble. So traditional Ayurveda takes babbling as one of the major diagnostic symptoms of fever, because your mind is heated, so you're not talking sense. So it does not take heat as a measurable commodity that can be exactly measured using a thermometer. All this is glossed over in those 1880s, 1890s, 1910 texts, where they say it's exactly the same thing. This reinvention happens through people like Binod Bihari Rai, and I'm quoting a text from 1908, but he starts writing in the 1880s. He's from Rajshahi in current-day Bangladesh, in the north of Bangladesh. And this is a poem, again, I'll not read out, but what you can see is that he's... two things I'll draw your attention to. First is the obvious reference to a rail engine. So railways are new. Railways are first introduced into South Asia in 1853. And he's using railways to think with. And he's saying that the rail engine, as long as it is cold, remains like a corpse in the same place. Water and fire, once added, it becomes warm. Notice how machines come alive then. And so in order to think about the body and body heat, he's using the image of the railway engine, which is at hand now. And he also then goes on to locate this heat as a substance, a dravya, called pitta. And pitta is now often talked of as one of the three doshas or humors. Now, humor is not a good translation. I would like to stick to para-humor at least. And it's equated, so Binod Bihari Rai is one of the first people who start equating heat with pitta, with this substance found in the body, which holds heat, which transmits heat. But how does he think of pitta? He thinks of it by drawing on electromagnetic theories of his age. And electromagnetism is, of course, huge in the long 19th century. It doesn't mean a single thing. It means various things to various people. It's only by the 1890s that under the influence of people like Lord Kelvin, electricity becomes something more concrete and measurable. Before that, it's getting into all kinds of things, and there's a huge amount of literature on what is called animal electricity. And animal electricity is this idea which gets into mesmerism, which gets into spiritualism, and a whole bunch of things in the Western context as well. And people like Ray are drawing from those sources. Now, they're trying to think of this kind of super energy that is, so they say they actually equate electricity with Vayu, which is another one of the so-called three humors. And they say Pitta is another one which has not been recognized by Western science yet. But it's just like electricity. It's just like electromagnetism, but just more of it. So again, another guy that Ray is in contact with, and they're quoting each other, who says Vayu, Pitta, and Kapha have to be understood in terms of electromagnetic theory. This emphasis on trying to translate body heat to make sense of body heat, because what's happening is they have the data now through the thermometer. They don't quite know what this heat is. What is it measuring? They have to reconcile it. They have to create some kind of a connection with their understandings of the body. And they do that by developing two related notions, which are both equally braided. One is this idea of a conservation of heat, which is now imagined as a fluid. And second is a notion they develop of snayus, which is a kind of a, in which, and the word snayu is there, just as the word nadi is there in much of the classical text, but it's used in a wide variety of ways. What happens in this period is snayus become a word within which the Western notions of vein and nerve are collapsed. And they start understanding it as a kind of composite of both veins and nerves. So what about conservations? I mentioned 2 points. I'm just going to develop them very briefly here. The idea about conservation draws on this idea of systematics and energetics, which is, again, a very big idea in the late 19th century in Western science, that the world is a closed system of energy, that there's a fixed form, fixed amount of energy, and that circulates. From the sun is the main producer of the energy, and then others, different organisms take up that energy and give off energy, and so there are all these energy balance equations that people come up with, and it's this world united with, it's completely a closed system which is united with by exchange of energy. And you get exactly that language in the Ayurvedic texts, where they're saying Pitta is nothing but Brahmatej, and Brahmatej is basically solar energy. They use the English word solar energy, and it's going into, and that is why the classics say that Brahma is everywhere, because he's actually energy. So it's being read into this idea of energy and systematics, but it's not just an history of ideas. The reason it makes so much sense to these guys is also because they're living in a world where electric telegraphs are all around them. So Binod Bihari Rai, whom I quoted, constantly lapses back into giving analogies of electric telegraphs. He says, just as you see in an electric telegraph, when one of those wires break, you can't pass electricity through it anymore. And that's because energy can't go through it. So similarly about gas lights, and Calcutta has, of course, gas lighting by the late 1880s, and it actually carries on till pretty late, till after most other cities have switched off gas lighting. And here again, the gas is supplied by one company, so there are gas pipelines sending out the gas that burns the street lamps. So these guys constantly refer to that. Those material changes in their social world is what makes these European ideas convincing for them, which is why they kind of look towards these models of energetics and systematics, because they're seeing it in their mind. They can make sense of it by referring to these concrete developments in their everyday world. So from this develops this idea of balance, that if it is a closed system, everything is exchanging energy, there has to be an idea of balance. And this is what today has become the standard form of Ayurveda. Everybody will tell you Ayurveda believes in that all disease is because of an imbalance of humors. You balance out your humors, everything is fine. That is a completely fictitious modern idea, that idea of balance. As Dominic Vujastic and Anthony Cerulli have both recently pointed out, in classical Ayurveda, there is no such concept of balance. It's, in fact, if you want to call them humors, even then, what matters is their displacement or misplacement, because these humors are supposed to be, humors within quotes, are supposed to be in particular parts of the body. If they get displaced, if you have the wrong type of humor in the wrong part of the body, that's what gives you disease, not this idea of balance. The balance idea comes partly from misreading classical Greek medicine into Ayurvedic medicine, but it also comes from this idea of energy conservation, which is coming up at the late 19th century. It creates in the process an idea of the internal Ayurvedic, so the Ayurvedic image of the body that emerges is one whose internal space is completely undifferentiated, because everything, it's a hydraulic system. All your humors are circulating, everything has to be balanced. It's like a big pump with nothing inside. It's a completely undifferentiated but enclosed anatomic space which is imagined now. And this is something that carries on even after energetics goes out of fashion, after endocrines and hormones become the main explanatory framework. This idea of an undifferentiated body where organs don't matter, where it's all about flows and energy, this continues. And this, of course, gets a huge fillip with all the New Agers who pick up on Ayurveda. Finally, so I'd mentioned there were two things. One is the conservation of energy idea. The second is this idea of Snayus. Here again, they draw extensively on European neurologists of the day, even though they're not really called neurologists, but people who were working in what we would today recognize as neurology, particularly Ernest Haeckel, who's a famous German Darwinian, actually, but also has kind of quirky edges to his Darwinism. So this image, for instance, which appears in an 1870 Bengali book, it also appears in Haeckel's texts with one difference. And that difference is, I don't know if everybody can see this image properly, but this image doesn't have a brain. It just has nerves everywhere. These channels, so even the head is full of channels. There's no brain. Now, if you see Haeckel's illustration of the same image, exact same pose, exact same everything, the only difference would be it would have a brain, because neurologists at this time were interested in neural networks, but it was all subordinated to the brain. In fact, some historians have recently called it the emergence of brainhood rather than personhood. So it's this, but this image gets rid of the brain. It takes on the network of nerves and snayus, but gets rid of the brain. But it also introduces a new element, which is taken from Tantrism, this idea of chakras. Again, New Age Ayurveda today has popularized this no end. Anybody who's heard of Ayurveda has heard of the chakras. But the chakras actually historically have nothing to do with Ayurveda. It comes out of Tantrism, it comes out of yoga, it does not overlap with the Ayurvedic literature. And it's only at this point that it's being incorporated. Hemchandra Rai, who's actually a qualified MBBS doctor practicing the Western system, who later on re-educates himself in Ayurveda, he's the one who creates this synthesis by combining neurology with this idea of chakras. And once again, we see that they constantly fall back on their material environment around them to allegorize this, to understand this. And here it's interesting that Katja Gwinther, whose book is just about to come out, who's worked on late 19th century German neurology, she mentions that in her case as well, she finds that people who were writing, neurologists who were writing on nerves in the body, constantly allegorized the body with a centralized state, so the body politic, as well as the telegraph. So the electric telegraph, the centralized state, and the body, according to Gwenther, are overlapping metaphorical realms. So these, and it's the same for these guys, with the difference that I mentioned, that of what I call Ayurvedic acephaly, that the brain is lost. It's not, and of course it makes sense. I mean, if you think of the Germans in this period, late 19th century, German unification under the Prussians, of course, strong centralized state, brain is important as a metaphor. If you think of the Ayurvedists, there's no standardization. They would not like to embrace the British imperial power. So there is a problem there. If they're allegorizing with the state, they are not going to talk of the centralized body that controls everything. In fact, so much so that even when they use the telegraph metaphor, if you look at the European uses of that metaphor, it often talks of a central clearing office, a central telegraph office. These guys leave out the central telegraph office bit. They just have different telegraph offices. So all these metaphors kind of mutually determine what they're going to say. But one other thing I would like to draw your attention to is that these, as you can probably make out, that these arrows have letters next to them. You would expect that there's a key somewhere in the book which tells you what those letters stand for. There's no key. So the image is in there, but they're not sure what the arrows actually will say. So I think it also shows some of the confusion that instilled, because this is the very first book in working this out. So this is what I call, and I promise this is the last slide, I'll stop after this. So this is what I call the Snayubic man, and this is this, by the Snayubic man I mean this inchoate body image, which is not a fully fleshed out image, but a partial image that is operationalized in the practice of modern Ayurveda. It is acephalous, it doesn't have a brain, but it thinks of the body as an undifferentiated, integrated space, irrigated by a lot of channels, which it calls snayus, and where balance of doshas starts becoming a key. It's created, every element of it is created by braiding eclectic strands of Indic, more localized Kaviraji, which I've sort of not touched on the talk today, and Western sciences together. And finally, the thought I would like to leave you with is the irony of the situation, that this period of reinvention, what is most ironic about it is that the more strenuously they tried to make Ayurveda authentically indigenous and traditional, it became more and more transnational and braided with other stuff. So I'm not sure whether that's as striking to you as it seems to me, but that's it from me. And I'd love questions and suggestions, whatever. Thank you.